Hello and welcome to the Game Theory Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Vicini. We are presented by CLNS Media. Today on the show, we have a little bit of a different thing because Cole Zwicker, with his weekly appearance, we had to push that back to Friday just because Cole got sick. So last second, I just G-chatted good friend of the program, Danny Leroux, and Danny was gracious enough to say, hey, we can do this right now. So we're going to do an NBA trade deadline kind of primer for the next week or so. So Danny, how's it going, man?
I just got quote retweeted from Patton Oswalt, so I'm doing pretty damn well.
Your mentions are a mess, aren't they?
Oh, of course. I mean, but it's the good kind of mess overall because this is a really fun time. And you and I were talking before about one of the distinct differences, and we're recording this on Wednesday, late afternoon Pacific time, the differences between having the trade deadline when there are games going on. Because we've already seen today the announcement that Nikola Mirotic and Tyreke Evans basically will not play until those situations are resolved, which means maybe up to a week, and then they still have to be moved. And so that is completely different than a little bit of awkwardness around guys talking during the All-Star game.
Yeah, so I think that this is actually a really good place to start because Tyreke Evans is number one on my list. As you mentioned, Adrian Wojnarowski reports that Tyreke Evans is not going to play until Memphis finds a new home for him. I mean, Tyreke to me is one of the toughest guys to gauge in terms of value on this trade market, but I also think there's a chance that he might be the most valuable piece on the trade market outside of the like DeAndre Jordan, Lou Williams tier that might not end up moving. So there's a decent chance Tyreke Evans is the best player traded at the trade deadline. What do you kind of feel about his game now that he's averaging, 20 points, 5 rebounds for a team where he has a lot of opportunity, but also a team that's really bad?
Tyreke is hard because he is certainly having a wonderful year, and he is also, I think he's right at that borderline where can be an important part of a good team, but I don't think you necessarily want him starting or finishing games. So that has a ceiling on it. I mean, there's certain teams in certain situations that can see that differently, and it also depends on who stays healthy and all that, obviously. Like, I'm sure that the Sixers would really like to have him right now when JJ Redick's out, but does that change when JJ Redick comes back and all that kind of stuff? So it's a real challenge to calibrate the value for him. And the other reason why Tyreke is so hard is because every single team in the league is treating him as a rental. Because the benefit for Memphis, they signed him for the biannual exception, making a little bit over $3 million, which is wonderful. That's an unbelievable value contract. But if you're trading him to a team that is over the cap, they gain no advantage in terms of re-signing him other than the good feelings that he generates by being on that team for as long as the season goes. And that is very different. You are less willing to give up something of substance for a player who is a rental as opposed to a player who is a part of your team moving forward, whether that be through restricted free agency or just having bird rights or another year under contract.
So yeah, I think that you bring up a great point there, just in general with his long-term value, but obviously teams are going to be acquiring him for the short-term value. They want a guy who they think can help them on a playoff push. One big question that I have with Tyreke Evans is how much he's going to help and how well he fits into a wide variety of schemes, because he's still shooting 39% from 3 on the season. But if you look over the course of the last month, that number has actually dipped to 29%. Do you buy Tyreke Evans as a shooter? I think that is probably the biggest question as to what you should try and give up to acquire Tyreke Evans. So Danny Leroux, do you buy him as a shooter?
I don't buy him as this shooter, but I do think that he's better than his overall resume. I mean, last year in Sacramento, he shot 44%, but again, that was only in 14 games. He was at 38% the year that he only played a little bit in New Orleans. So those are small sample sizes. We're dealing with that entirely with him, but I do think that his stroke looks better. So that's certainly a good sign, and I don't think he's really taking, like, his discretion is a lot better than it used to be, which is important as a part of this too. I mean, being a better shooter, but taking better shots, as those who watch Andrew Wiggins can attest to. So I think that this is not 100%, and especially if we're talking about, like, the playoffs when teams just defend better, and so you're not going to have the same windows that you have at this point. And also, I mean, you can make the counter argument that he'll be playing with better teammates. so he will be less the focus of opposing defenses. But
sure,
what I would say with him that's hard between him and Lou is that we've seen Lou Williams do what Lou Williams does in such a wider variety of circumstances that I feel more comfortable with that. Whereas with Tyreke, there's a little bit more of a risk valuation there because he could do it. I think that he is better situated for that role now than he ever was, but it's not proving it. And Tyreke, he's only 28. I mean, you think about just all the stuff that's happened in his career, that he's still, kind of right around that age. But as I said, that matters a lot less when you can't really re-sign a guy using anything other than your mid-level.
Yeah, Danny brings up the fact that Tyreke Evans over the last 3 years has been a much better shooter. I mean, over 450 attempts over those 3 years, he's at 38%. That's a pretty good track record. The shot looks better. I think that that's the biggest key, but I don't know that I fully trust it yet in a playoff setting where, like you said, defenses are going to be ramped up. So with that being said, do you think the Grizzlies get a first-round pick for him?
I wouldn't give up a first-round pick for him if that's the only value gotten in the trade. However, what the Grizzlies should be doing here, like what the Suns should have done in the Eric Bledsoe trade, and the Grizzlies situation is even more explicit in this, is take on a little bit of long-term money, like specifically meaning next season, and that combined with Tyreke, I would feel much more comfortable giving up a first-round pick. And this is kind of the logic that some people have used with the Sixers idea, is the Sixers giving up Jared Bayless in the deal and getting Tyreke, and you probably need some salary cap filler in that deal. But that format gives the other team more value, and it doesn't really cost the Grizzlies anything because they aren't going to have cap space anyway. So they're losing something they never had, and they're gaining a better asset. So I think that would be a very smart move. I just don't think a rental for Tyreke with where these teams are. He could help a lot of teams, but and also the other challenge is there aren't that many just late firsts in the right place. So for example, Atlanta has Houston's first. Sure, Houston's first is maybe about right value for him, but Atlanta doesn't care. That's not the type of thing that they're looking for. So I think the Sixers pick is too good for Tyreke. That's going to be either a late lottery pick or a strong playoff pick. And so I think that's too much for him. But if it was 25 to 30, yeah, I could see that's the same problem with Mirotic, though, where those are not in the hands of the teams that are really willing to give them up.
So my sneaky weird idea for this is, if I was Memphis, I would be trying to get my hands on Julius Randle because I don't have money going forward into the future. I just don't have cap space because I have Marc Gasol, Chandler Parsons, and Mike Conley all locked up long term. So I can afford to pay Julius Randle a decent amount of money. Do you think that you could do a three-way trade where basically Tyreke Evans goes to Boston, Julius Randle goes to Memphis, and then Boston sends their first-round pick to Los Angeles, along with someone like, Shimi Ojeleye or, Abdel Nader or something like that. And, you could throw Memphis, Abdel Nader even. Something along those lines. I mean, if the Lakers are set on cutting salary money, I don't know if they're going to do much better than a solid rotational wing and a first-round pick for Julius Randle.
I like it. I think that there is a value to it for Memphis. Also, as you and I have discussed off this podcast, and we have discussed it on mine, this year I think is going to be really dry for restricted free agents. So you're also making a bet on the restricted market, which is interesting if you're Memphis because, they could just wait him out like they did with JaMychal Green, and I think that worked out well for them. They got him at a better number than both of us expected. So I think there's a soundness to that. You could also make the argument that Julius Randle would be a good bet. I actually wrote a piece for the Sporting News today about how they could use restricted free agency for both Marcus Smart and then another guy with Julius Randle and Rodney Hood being the two guys I singled out, basically trying to create a human trade exception. So Boston could actually do that themselves. It would just depend on what they want. Tyreke is definitely a good fit for what they want right now for this season. So they could prioritize that. You could even maybe structure a way where they can get both of those guys. It would require more gymnastics than we've discussed, and I would have to actually work this out. But the idea behind it is sound in terms of getting Julius Randle somewhere, getting a value for him, because my assumption right now, and I'd love to talk with you about this, is that whether it's now, whether it's in July, if the Lakers need to move Jordan Clarkson, much less Waldang, everybody knows he's a negative asset, I think they need to have something, they're going to need to attach something to get rid of Clarkson. It might not have to be something great. And getting that piece in the Julius Randle trade is about as good as being able to move Jordan Clarkson in the Julius Randle trade.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Do you think the Jordan Clarkson contract is underwater?
I do. They're just, so if you don't see him as a starter, which I do not, then he is you basically would be treating him as a very high-end backup, and very high-end backups in the modern NBA, unless you can really finish games, I think that those guys aren't really in the $12 million range right now, especially because very few teams have money to handle that. So I think that it's not like a huge negative like Dang's is.
Yeah.
But I would say he's more to me in the $6 to $8 million range. And so if he's in the $6 to $8 million range, then that means you have about $4 million, $5 million in dead money dead money in that way per year. And so that means it's a slight negative asset. But of course, as was the case with Blake Griffin on his contract, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So all it takes is one team saying, hey, we really like Jordan Clarkson, to change that. I can only really use myself because I can't talk to all the other GMs.
Yeah, I liked Clarkson a lot more earlier this year when he was shooting 35% from three, and looked like he had shown actual growth in that regard, as opposed to now where he's back down to his career level of 31, 32% from three. If he's going to shoot that number, that contract's definitely underwater, because you basically have to use him as a lead ball handler, otherwise you can't space the floor. It's really hard to figure out a way to make him work as an off-ball, non-lead ball handler. So, the Clarkson deal's probably a little bit underwater. But yeah, I like the idea of, being able to, trade Julius Randle for actual value. I think he is an actual valuable asset going forward. And the better the Lakers can do to get as much for him as possible, the better situation they're going to be in long term.
Right, and I know that there's this pipe dream that the Lakers fans have that they can somehow clear the space for two max guys and keep Randle, but the problem with that is, if they really want to think about it, the way that works is they're giving up a player that their fans like even more. That could be Brandon Ingram, that could be Lonzo, whatever that's going to be, because Dang, we all know that he's not a value on his contract. And Jordan Clarkson, and an important part for people, and people listening to your show probably already know this, is that when you, let's say one of the options for the Lakers, particularly on Dang, more so than Clarkson because they can move him, is the stretch provision. The problem with the stretch provision, so the good thing is you can spread out a player's remaining money over double the amount of years on the contract plus one. So Dang has 2 years after this year, so if they stretched him this summer, it would be over 5.
What, with 6.9 each year, something like that?
Something like that. Yeah. And so that sounds good, and in certain ways it is good, but the downside is you can't move that money for any reason.
Yeah.
And you're committing to that. So the only time you would really ever use that is if I need this space to do X thing. And if you need that space to do X thing, and then you're doing that right away. But you can't do anything about it. Josh Smith is like this. Josh Smith is $5.2 million on the Pistons books for the next 2 years after this one. That counts against the cap. That counts against the luxury tax, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And so they need to be very pragmatic about being ahead of the ball in terms of it, because those decisions are permanent, and let's assume the best case scenario happens and they get really good players to want their money, then they're going to have to move quickly. And so the less you have to do quickly, the easier it is going to be, because there just aren't going to be that many teams with cap space.
Before we move on to the LA teams, because I think they're really interesting, just to tie it up on Tyreke Evans, what do you think the best fit is for Tyreke Evans?
Boston's a very good one. I think that he could just be a part of their second unit. I like his fit, however they want to do it with Smart and Rozier, just a guy who's good with the ball in his hands. That's a good one. Depending, they would have to change the whole idea of their second unit, but I would think that the Warriors would actually be a really logical fit, because they basically just go, okay, we're going to have all defenders and Tyreke. It's kind of actually like what OKC did in their closing five with Russ. Just go to that and be like, okay, Tyreke, we'll get a decent enough offense, and then we'll have all these guys defend. That could work too. So I would say those two teams of the good ones, and because those two teams, you can develop a way where they need some shot creation, whereas Cleveland doesn't need Tyreke. They have a bunch of guys, and if Isaiah is not the answer, then Tyreke is not going to be the answer either, because he's not that much better in terms of what they need.
Well, if Isaiah is not the answer, Cleveland should not be trading future assets.
That's also true.
Yeah, like they're screwed.
At least future assets that are better than their own first round pick this year, because that you can use that on a lark. That's totally fine.
The other one's Washington, right? With John Wall out now, they're at pick number 20. That starts to get to where I'm a little bit uncomfortable moving that pick for Tyreke Evans, given the fact that it's pretty clumped there. They could really end up anywhere from like 17 to 25 still.
You would want some savings involved in that, and that's something Memphis could facilitate as well. They could take on Jason Smith's contract. They could take on Sheldon Mack, who's out for the year. They could take on his money and just save Washington a little bit, that sort of thing. Yeah, you could make a move there if you wanted to, and that actually happened in the Dunc'd On mock trade deadline.
Yeah, that's not a terrible idea to me at all. Let's go on ahead and move on to the Los Angeles teams. The Lakers, obviously are trying to create more cap space, right? They want to, if they can, move a Julius Randle, move a Jordan Clarkson for value. Clarkson's a little bit more complicated, obviously. You've written about Kentavious Caldwell-Pope as a potential buyout guy, but I think we'll probably talk about that later on a different podcast where I can get you on, and we'll talk about the buyout market eventually at some point. But there's them, and then you have the Clippers as well. The Clippers have DeAndre Jordan, Avery Bradley, and Lou Williams, all of whom are expiring, and the Clippers are saying that they want to maintain free agency space, but also not necessarily take a huge step back to where they're like tanking or taking a massive drop off in talent level. So which one of those situations is more interesting to you?
For the next week, the Clippers are, because the Clippers, there's a definitional issue that they just need to figure out. And with the Blake Griffin trade, I was deeply critical of it. Those who want to know my thoughts on that, you could listen to Dunc'd On. You could read my piece of the Sporting News.
Yeah.
There is an argument that the Clippers made that move partially because it was just such a strong offer that even though they might not have, wanted to move Blake Griffin, it's like, hey, come on, like if somebody's going to do something like this, you might as well. And so why that is important is because it affects the way they think about the next step. If it were me, if Steve Ballmer was asking my opinion, I would say get rid of everything that's not nailed down unless you think, A, I want to sign this guy to his next contract, and B, I'm not getting a good offer for them. Because, if nobody offers anything for DeAndre, you can keep him around even if you end up leaving and you lose him for nothing. But why you need to have that approach is because then that makes the discussions happen. If you're a little bit more standoffish, there are a lot of other options out there. So you have to listen, but you need to talk. And so it's going to be a real challenge for them because they need to make all these decisions, and their whole world just changed a couple days ago. That's very different from being able to talk with your scouts, talk with everybody with this idea of, okay, this is where we are, this is where we're going. And yeah, I mean, if it were me, I would be talking about moving Tobias. I'd be talking about moving Avery Bradley. I'd be talking about DeAndre and Lou Williams, obviously, and going in that direction. That doesn't mean moving all of them, burning it down. I would also be talking to teams about Patrick Beverley and just saying, Abby, there are going to be limitations there because that team is getting no value from him this year, and next year with, I believe it was microfracture, right? Like I know it was something that scared me, so that makes me think it was microfracture.
Let me look that up. Keep talking. We'll
and so basically the reason you do that is because you need to eventually pivot, and also the Clippers pick next year. This could really screw the Celtics. The pick that they owe the Celtics by way of Memphis from that horrible Lance Stevenson Jeff Green trade is that pick is lottery protected. So if they don't make the playoffs next year, and it would theoretically be the year after that, they keep it. Yeah. And so if they bottom out a little bit for next year, whether or not they get LeBron, which I don't think they will, then you can build an awesome team. Like that, they're not that far away. It could, because they'll get free agents like that. That's just the way it's going to work. They might not get LeBron or KD or somebody like that, but they can get guys interested. So I think that's the best pull for it. But you can make an argument, which is an interesting one, that the difference in draft pick isn't as important as the difference in reputation, and that's where I think they're going to go. I think they're going to keep Tobias Harris, and they'll probably keep a couple other too many guys by saying, hey, it's good if we make the playoffs, and tell people, hey, we're still good without Blake. I disagree with that, but I understand that that's probably going to be where they go.
So yeah, I agree with you that if I was them, I would be moving everything I could. I think you would get a first round pick for DeAndre Jordan. We agree with that, right?
Yeah, I would, especially if, you talk to him and he wants something else. And he's not going to, I don't think at this point he's going to take a discount to stay. And if he's not going to take a discount, I don't really want his next contract. As durable as DeAndre has been, I sit there and go, okay, well, if the player that he was this year, like that guy, if he gets close to a max or a max contract, unless you're really good for 2018-19 and probably 19-20, I don't think he's providing as much value as his contract is going to require.
Yeah, I agree with you there. So I would be moving DeAndre. I would be moving Avery Bradley. Avery Bradley has like kind of a funky thing where you can only trade him by himself and get an asset back. Would you rather have Avery Bradley or Tyreke Evans at the trade deadline?
Oh, that's interesting. I think I would rather have Avery Bradley because I believe in ceiling. And Avery Bradley, as a one-on-one defender, he doesn't make, Ken Pelton wrote a great piece on this, he doesn't make a team's defense good by itself, and his RPM-style numbers have been shaky for years, but he can basically wipe one guy off the map, and in a playoff series, that's incredibly valuable. So I think I would go with him in most circumstances, but if the team really needed shot creation, you can make an argument for Tyreke.
Yeah, I wish there was a way that we could find him to Houston. Like that would just be incredible, I think, because, I can't imagine having a better player to just sick on Stephen Curry for 7 games, right? Like that's a great asset to have. And I think that, in Cleveland's case, that makes a lot of sense to me. Like if Cleveland comes down to it at the end of the day where their only real best chance is Channing Frye and their own first-round pick for Avery Bradley, that's probably a move I make, right?
That's a move I would make probably for both teams. Of course, if you're the Clippers, you take the best offer possible. Somebody makes an offer for a better first-round pick, but look, Cleveland's first-round pick might be pretty good this year. It's not going to be a lottery pick. They're going to make the playoffs, but that certainly is on the table, and neither one of those teams really wants to, I'm sure the Cavs would like to move long-term salary, but an expiring for expiring makes sense with the desires of both teams.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought too. The Clippers maintain cap space. The Cavs get their guy that they can throw on Stephen Curry and just hope that they can take him out of a series as much as you can ever take Stephen Curry out of a series, and just go from there, right? Lou Williams is the other guy that's really interesting here. I don't know what to do with Lou. He's another guy that I think just makes perfect sense for Washington over the course of the next 2 months with John Wall out. Like the Washington first-round pick plus, man, I keep forgetting that they don't really have anything expiring, which makes it really tricky. Yeah, I don't even know if Washington works. Where is your favorite Lou Williams spot?
I don't really have one at this point because a lot of the teams where I think he would really help, they don't really have the flexibility. Washington is an example of that. I actually think he would help Minnesota a ton because it doesn't seem like Tibbs is going to restructure the rotation, which they should. So he would really help there. He would help New Orleans, but they don't really have the capacity to make that happen because of all of their other moves, let's call it. And so, yeah, I think that he could help a lot of teams. He reminds me a lot of, I guess maybe Serge Ibaka is this type of guy when he was traded to the Magic, and actually to a point when he was traded to the Raptors, though I think we all saw that coming, where I think he'll end up somewhere I'm happy with, but it's just not in a trade that I can envision well because, again, we need to know what the Clippers want. And so I think he'll get moved. Like the Sixers would be fun for him.
Yeah, the Sixers are fun, and I just thought of the Knicks because, if the Knicks really want to make the playoffs, to send a statement to Kristaps Porzingis or at least make an effort to make the playoffs, could you offer? Yeah, but
do you want to give up a real asset for a rental this year, a rental next year? It just seems like this isn't the right year. Like for me, if you're the Knicks, what you're going to throw your stuff in if you can do it is Kemba, if you can get him. But I'm not sure you can, based on what Michael Jordan has said. But you do that because that's a wholesale change that affects you for multiple years. That sort of thing. Otherwise, I think but again, that's not exactly the Knicks' MO. So you could be right. Like that's the parallel to the Serge Ibaka to the Magic thing is where it's a team that feels pressure that shouldn't feel pressure. And that could be there.
Like for the Knicks, does Doug McDermott, Willie Hernan-Gomez, and Damian Dotson plus a second, do we think that gets it done for Lou Williams?
I don't think it does because I don't see where those guys fit in. I think I value Willie Hernangomez a lot more than a lot of front office people do, and so I always caution myself in that sort of a circumstance. It's not bad, like it's certainly there is a merit to it, but I don't think that's really the way either of those front offices is thinking right now.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Philadelphia is a really interesting one too. They're obviously being mentioned in the Tyreke sweepstakes. One trade that's been floated is getting off of Jared Bayless's money for next year, plus their first round pick for Tyreke Evans. I do like the idea of moving the Bayless contract and attaching their first round pick. I just would do it for someone different than Tyreke Evans if I could.
He could definitely help them. I mean, if they're going to play, one of the key ideas with the Sixers, and I didn't get to this in my piece because I wanted to focus more on the deadline, is if they want to keep Simmons and Embiid together and not stagger them, which I would support because those guys do so well together, and if you want them to eventually close games for you, maybe even in the NBA Finals long term, you want them to be as comfortable together as you can, then if you're doing those guys together, you probably need actually more shot creation in the time they're not on the floor. And so Tyreke's not bad. He's definitely going to be below them in the pecking order, but he can provide some value. And now that he can shoot threes, he can play off the ball a little bit. So I think that could work. And if you can get off the money, that's where it starts to potentially be worth a first-round pick, because that 8.5 or whatever it is million is going to be super valuable for them, and not having to give up an asset for it in July, even if that asset is a little bit smaller than this would be, is still really good, because then you can go into meetings and say, we don't have to do anything, we can offer you the max.
So if you are the 76ers, could you do Trevor Booker, Jared Bayless, and your first round pick for Kentavious Caldwell-Pope and Julius Randle?
So that gets into something really interesting, which is the idea of, and it would depend on what KCP wants. Right. They could also theoretically do something where they actually stay over the cap. And so what staying over the cap would do for them, because they could also wipe those guys away. If they wanted KCP, then they could keep JJ Redick. And so the good thing about that is it opens that door. The downside of it is that they have to be like, this is our guy. And my instinct is I think they're hopeful about getting a meeting with Paul George.
I think they are too, but does that stop them from that?
Well, Julius Randle makes it harder too. So like you're giving up assets. I think that's a very interesting. I hadn't put that all the way together until you brought it up. But yeah, I think there's so the other reason you would do it. So like you're giving up a first round pick, and it's probably going to be in the teens, which is, I mean, that's incredibly valuable in any draft, but this draft, I'm sure people like that. It would give you an audition for KCP, and there's an argument to be made in a lot of these circumstances where the value of an audition is underrated. And that's not only in terms of the Sixers pitching KCP, but saying, is this guy right for our locker room? Is this guy right for our system? All that kind of stuff. Because that piece of information, if they're going to make a commitment to some player this offseason for 80 to 90 million, if not more, that piece of information is ludicrously valuable for them. And so I think, I mean, but the other problem with it, I think you need to spin Bayless somewhere else. Which you could. But you could. The Lakers could give up something of another style of asset. You know, there are facilitators all around the league. Like they could do something with that as well. So, yeah, I think there's something there. I'd probably need to have some more nuance to it. Yeah. But the concept of it is intriguing, and something that's always good for people who like to do kind of like fake trades is I've said this part of it before. I've always think about the why or why not from both teams' perspectives. That is definitely true. But also think about, well, okay, if this is the base, what permutations of this would one side bring up, and would they probably consider? And that's exactly what this is. It's like, so I think one of the two sides would say, well, what about blank? And sometimes those are the deals that actually end up happening. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. That's a really, really good point. There's frameworks being flown around this time of year from every NBA team to every NBA team, right? But where trades actually get done is trying to find just that little small, tiny, adjustment that makes sense for everyone involved to get it done. And that's where it gets really hard to actually consummate trades. Yeah, and this year is going to be so weird too, not only because the trade deadline is earlier, not necessarily chronologically, that doesn't matter as much, but in terms of where we are in the season, it's earlier enough. But a piece of good fortune for the teams, especially that are sellers, I guess, is that the playoff picture is clearer now than it could have been. I mean, I think right now, really in both conferences, you're looking more in the 9 teams for 8 spots kind of range.
Yeah.
And so there's a value to that. I guess there's also a value to having like 12 teams. If you're a seller, there are like 12 teams that think they can be in, and so you're trying to pit them against each other, that sort of thing. So I don't know. Yeah, I guess maybe it's not as good for sellers. Maybe it's better for buyers. But there's always going to be some dynamic. I guess that's where it is right now, and I'm excited to see where this goes, because there's also this. So there's this group of guys, including Mirotic and Tyreke, who it feels like they have to move.
Right.
And so those guys, I don't find them as interesting, because the question there is basically who gives you the best thing back. That's not as much of a question. It's more, what else are we going to see? And of course, the Blake Griffin trade is probably going to be the biggest one. I would be shocked if it wasn't. The biggest one like that, where you don't see it coming. It was not a move that had any urgency to it in terms of, like this guy has to move before the deadline, otherwise this is dead. And those are fun because they can come absolutely out of nowhere.
Yeah, oh no, those are always the craziest ones, because you just never, like you said, you never know. And I'm glad you brought up Nikola Mirotic, because there was a reported trade yesterday that was, it seems like kind of scuttled, where Nikola Mirotic was going to go to New Orleans for the Pelicans' first-round pick, in addition to the Omer Ashik albatross, which is less albatrossy than it used to be. I believe he has, $12 million after this year left, right?
14.2, something like that. And it's and the other good piece, depending on what the acquiring team, should there be one, does, is that since it's a partial guarantee for that extra year, if a team wanted to stretch him, they could stretch him over 5 years rather than 3, which is kind of nice. I mean, if I were Chicago, I would only be stretching him, let's say that trade happens, if somebody comes to you in early July and says, I want to take your money. Like, you don't preemptively stretch him. But in that case, you have that option should you need it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. This deal was scuttled, though, because Nikola Mirotic has a no-trade clause because of the surrounding events of his, eventual restricted free agency contract last year. If you sign a 1-year contract, essentially, after being a restricted free agent, you get a no-trade clause. That's the layman's way of putting it, right, Danny?
Well, it's a little bit, because it doesn't have to be restricted. Like JaVale McGee has one of those, because it's basically, if you sign a 1-year contract and you would get earlier 4 bird rights off of it, then you get a no trade, because if you get traded, you lose that. So that's the thing with Mirotic. And so with Mirotic, it sounds like what the issue is that he's worried about that option not being picked up. And so what he can do in certain ways is he can try to, whether it succeeds or not is an open question, force the Bulls to pick up the option before trading him, which of course would have to be done with the consent of the acquiring team, because then they can trade him without him vetoing it, because then it doesn't become a 1-year expiring contract. And so I think that's what he's trying to do. And there is a theoretical idea that New Orleans could, depending on what happens with DeMarcus and all that other stuff, they could decline his option should it still exist, and then pay him more money over more years, probably less money in 2018. But he can't know that. Yeah. They can't commit to that because it would violate the CBA, and they don't know it right now. And so in that case, like, yes, there is this hypothetical where it benefits, but he bears all that risk. So I could see why he's like, hey, man, I have $12.5 million sitting here if I just hold out a little bit longer. And the Pelicans, this was a very good deal for them. They were able to unload a bad contract and get a good player who can help them right away. If that was the sticking point, and it could have been something else. It could have been protection. It could have been more than one thing. If that was the sticking point, the Pelicans screwed up. And they should make that deal. They should just say, if that's what it takes to get the deal done, we'll pick up that option. Because if they need that money, they can move him. Maybe let's say he has a rougher year than we hoped, and there's a little bit of negative value on that contract. There's not going to be so much that he's unmovable unless he gets like hurt in some severe way. So I think New Orleans should still strike on this, even if that's what it takes. But again, we don't know exactly what the sticking point is.
So let's go on ahead and go through a little bit of a rapid fire kind of idea here, since I've got you for like 10 or 12 more minutes. So One of the more interesting ideas here that I have is that there are certain teams that have actual assets in terms of expiring money. And you've written quite a bit about the value of expiring money this year. So Memphis has $14 million that they could realistically move in expiring money. Memphis has no salary cap space moving forward. I think they should probably be trying to find a way to capitalize on that. I think, again, that's where my idea with the Lakers comes into play and them trying to find a way into the Julius Randle sweepstakes. Dallas has 17 million in expirings and enough cap space to where they could still have a max salary spot if they don't use all of that to take on like actual players' money. Atlanta has 12 million in salary cap space, and Atlanta's just expiring deals, and they're just not a big free agency destination. So why would you not consider something like this? What are some deals out there that you kind of like the idea of you kind of using salary cap space and expiring contracts for certain teams to take on assets and certain teams to end up becoming more better, I guess, free agency destinations this offseason?
One additional note with Dallas, not only do they have that money in expiring contracts, they still have $13.5 million in cap space.
Yeah.
It's crazy how much flexibility they have. And all of these teams, so like Dallas in particular, they should use that cap space at the bare minimum on expiring contracts. They can get little more piddly assets for that. But the teams that I would be talking to, and one of the big challenges, I haven't written about this yet, but there's a piece that's in the works, is what I think is happening right now is that certain teams just don't know if they're going to need to clear the space, and so it's kind of like, well, why clear it if you're not sure? The Sixers are sort of in this camp, where they don't know if they're going to need to clear that extra $8 million, so why am I going to give up a first-round pick or whatever?
Yep.
One team that definitely does now is Denver. Denver, because of the weird structure of Nikola Mirotic's, not only his contract, but his rise to prominence, they're going to, in all likelihood, decline his team. Nikola Jokic. Did I say Nurkic?
Mirotic.
Anyway, Mirotic. No.
Yeah. We're good.
Anyway, so Jokic has he has a team option at the minimum for next year, which you're suddenly going, oh my God, why would you decline that? And the answer is because if you decline it, you make him a restricted free agent, and then you can't lose him. So if they do that, they're going to be paying a lot more money. They just gave an extension to Gary Harris. They're paying Paul Millsap. So they need to clear some serious money off of their books if he's going to get the max or close to it. So I would be, if I were them, I would be talking to those teams and the Phoenix Suns, who have Greg Monroe's expiring contract. Not as much about the expiring dude, but about getting rid of money for next year. So Darrell Arthur and Kenneth Faried. Arthur makes $7.5 million. Fareed makes 13.8.
I would also throw Wilson Chandler into this boat at 12 million.
Sure, you could throw Wilson Chandler in there too. I think even if he's having a year that's disappointing, he provides more value just because if you can get like 15 minutes a game from him as a wing, that's a little bit more valuable. But sure, you can do that as well. But so and maybe the asset asking price is a little bit less for him.
Right.
And so you can go I think they should be having those conversations now, because while they will be able to, with their structure, they could even, if they have the guts to, go into the season over the tax and just get under it by the end of the year. That's just, some teams just don't have the stomach for it. It's a very hard thing to do. And their contracts aren't so heavy. Like, I mean, Darrell Arthur is $7.5 million. Like, yeah, that's a lot of money, but it's not an unreasonable sum. So I would be sitting there talking to teams if I were them and seeing basically what is the lowest price per dollar that you can get. And if that price per dollar is close to reasonable, I would be talking to them. There are a series of other teams that like and then the other one is probably the Lakers, but I don't think that's the way they're considering this right now, but they should be. But the other big elephant in the room that needs to be discussed if we're talking about this is a lot of teams, basically everybody would give up assets who has one to give up a guy who is paid through 2019-20, so that's 2 seasons after this year. Mm-hmm. But I don't think anybody right now is willing to take on that money because that's so far into the future and teams don't know what they're going to be. So like even, like the Brooklyn Nets could theoretically take on money. They could, lots of these teams could. But they're saying, they're going, well, crap, maybe we're going to want to be a free agency team in 2019. Why are we selling that away right now? Whereas this summer, I think teams have a better idea. Like Phoenix, to me, they should be selling their 2018 space because what are they going to do in free agency at this point? Whereas,
well, they shouldn't want to do anything. That doesn't necessarily mean they won't do anything.
Right. Whereas in 2019, that's going to be the year where Devin Booker is, depending on what happens with him with an extension, which is a whole thing that at some point I'll probably write about. But basically that's the year where the rubber meets the road for them. So I can understand why they don't want to commit to that. But like these teams, so basically my feeling is that both sides should be being more proactive, but I assume that neither side is going to be.
Well, this is why like a team like Orlando is so fucked. Like they have Yvonne Fournier on the books for, I believe, 3 more years after this into 2021. They have Bismack Biyombo into the 2020 year. They have DJ Augustine into the 2020 year. I mean, that's $40 million of not value commensurate to their contract. And it's hard for me to figure out, especially given the fact that they're going to have to pay Aaron Gordon this summer. What do you do with Elfrid Payton? I don't really know. I think Elfrid Payton's kind of an interesting, sneaky guy that if I was Orlando, I might look to move him, just given the constitution of this roster right now. Because I think I actually might be able to get value, or I might be able to attach him to something like Nikola Vucevic and, you know, actually get off of that money. You know what I mean?
I do, but what I mean, to me at this point, considering how kind of messed up their books are, I would kind of be treating those things as sunk costs right now and basically saying, hey, we're kind of screwed no matter what here for the next couple of years in terms of our salary books. So let's focus on getting assets and then basically making it so maybe we can be relevant by the time this money comes off. I think that's the better, to me, that's the better tact. It's a very, very bitter pill to swallow in certain ways because the awkwardness of having a bunch of guys on your roster that you don't want to be there long term is a little bit weird. But I think it leads to better outcomes as long as those guys aren't so good that they will help their pick. But guess what? Those guys aren't right now.
So my last question to you before I let you go. Who is the most underrated, not talked about trade asset on the market right now? Or that could theoretically be on the market is probably a better way to phrase it.
That's an interesting question. I'm going to think about it for a second. I've
talked extensively about Spencer Dinwiddie. I think that Brooklyn should trade him. And I think they would get a first-round pick pretty easily for him. Let's try and avoid Spencer Dinwiddie, though.
Yeah, I also made him a primary focus in the mock trade deadline for people who want to hear that I was Denver and acquired him very zealously. I asked about him 3 separate times during our recording and then eventually got him. I was very proud of that, and there was a reason for it. You can listen to it. This is a weird year for it because, for example, I really like Maurice Harkless. He's having a bad year.
Yeah.
But I think you could help somebody. I think you could be, if let's say Portland moves on from him at this deadline, I think team could be sitting there going, wow, that's good. I'll bring up one. I'm not sure he's necessarily the best, but it's definitely under the radar. Juancho Hernan-Gomez.
Yeah.
I really like him as a player. I think he has good head on shoulders. I think bare minimum to me, I expect him to be a rotation player, but I could absolutely see him being a starter. He is out of the rotation for Denver, partially due to getting mono at exactly the wrong time, partially due to Trey Lyles just being pretty awesome offensively for the last little while. So Denver, they can throw a pick in terms of being an asset to unload some of the salary, but they can also throw Juancho. And I would probably rather have Juancho than a lot of the pick assets because I think he can be a good player, provide something of value. And so I think he could be he's a talented player that could be moved. Will Barton, similarly, I think they
Malik Beasley, too.
Yeah, I don't think they would move Will Barton right now because of what they need. But let's say they made another move, and in that move got a player who can help them, then maybe Will Barton gets more available. And he could help out numerous teams and also with him, unlike with Tyreke, you get his full bird rights, so you could re-sign him.
Yeah, no, I like that idea. Sorry, this is actually my last question. What does Cleveland do? What is your favorite move for the Cleveland Cavaliers for them to actually take advantage of all of the crazy assets that they have, and actually make the most of what their trade assets are? Because this is a team that suffers from the idea of opportunity cost, right? There are a billion moves out there that could actually really help them. Pete Zayas from over at Lakers Film Room was like, oh, we could do the Cavs pick and Jordan or Iman Shumpert for Jordan Clarkson. That would help the Cavs. And I was like, yeah, that would help the Cavs, but they can do way better than that deal for that pick. So what is your favorite way for the Cavs to maximize their assets?
That's an interesting... really, the world is their oyster. First of all, my favorite thing for them to do before everything that just happened was trading Kevin Love. I think that basically his contract is going to be perceived, I think, in a very different way over the summer if LeBron leaves. And so, I don't think, as good of an offensive player as he is, I don't think he's essential for them being good offensively. So it would have been more in that range. Outside of that, because now I think that's so hard to make a trade happen. It's not impossible, but it's so hard.
It's hard. It's really tough.
Yeah, I mean, Avery Bradley's a good fit for that. Okay, so my favorite thing from an asset perspective is something I wrote about, which is them getting KCP and Nerlens Noel via buyout. Yeah. Basically, Rich Paul, the clutch thing, leaning on both those teams and saying, hey, and they could actually acquire Nerlens by trade. That wouldn't be a big deal, but it would save Dan Gilbert a lot of money if they just got them by signing, because they would make less money. And so why the Lakers should do that is because you want to make Rich Paul happy. And if you do it by buyout, there is basically no way for the Cavs to re-sign KCP. That's the smart way about doing it that way, as opposed to trading him there. And making Rich Paul happy is the smartest thing they can do, because making Rich Paul happy makes LeBron James happy. And making LeBron James happy is a bigger positive right now for you than winning an extra couple games. So you go in that realm, and what's so fun about that is they can, even though the buyout deadline is a month from now, I would imagine that since the Lakers' situation isn't really changing, that they can know whether that's coming. And if it is, then you don't give up a ton of assets to get George Hill or to get Avery Bradley, because you're getting somebody who is not the same guy but is similar, and I think KCP's defense is awesome, for basically nothing. And you could even make a really baller argument that you still get Avery Bradley, so you can roll out a lineup in case Isaiah's not ready of Bradley plus KCP, plus LeBron, plus Crowder, plus whichever big man they want. So maybe that's
a terrific idea.
Yeah, and they can do both. Like, they can do both with those two guys. With George Hill, it gets a little bit complicated because of the money he has for next year, and it's hilarious that Dan Gilbert, of all people, tried to get him to leave money on the table. But as the reporting is from Windhorse, and so I would say something in that realm, like try to give up something for Avery Bradley. That first round pick would be one way of doing it. That their own first, obviously not the Nets pick, and then. Because I don't think DeAndre helps them much against the Warriors or the Rockets. I think that's an overstated benefit for them. And then if you can get KCP, get Noel, so try to move off some of their minimum guys. If you have to throw some money into that deal, by all means. And then you roll with KCP and Noel if you can get him, Bradley if you can get him, and then everything else. And if you do it that way, you've only given up maybe one late first round pick.
So if you're doing that, I might go out and try and get Tyreke Evans.
Yeah, the reason why I think you get Avery instead of Tyreke is because you don't know for sure that you're going to get KCP. Like, unless he agrees, if he agrees to a buyout tomorrow, then yeah. But other than that, you do it as just a risk mitigation thing. Like, that's true. So. But it is certainly an idea that if you felt like locked in 100% on that, then Tyreke makes more sense with that team than KCP. But I think putting a hat on a hat in that sort of case actually totally makes sense, because you're going to need guys to defend Steph Curry all the time, or James Harden, or whoever else. And so if you have two guys that can do it and maybe even play them together, oh man, that would be so much fun.
Yeah. Danny, tell the people where they can find your work in all of the places.
Oh, good Lord. So writing work, The Athletic, Sporting News, RealGM Radio, podcasting, Dunc'd On Basketball Podcast. It's a longer name even than that. RealGM Radio. Sometimes Warriors Watch. Haven't done one in like a month. And then the Twitter NBA show, which Nate and I do. It's a basically alternate commentary we do it for really big games. And so we will be doing that on Saturday for Cavs Rockets, and then we'll be doing it for OKC against the Warriors next week.
Danny, you're the best. Thanks for taking the time.
Absolutely.
This has been the Game Theory Podcast. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes. We'll be back later this week at some point, but I want to get Danny out of here, so we're going to keep it short and sweet. Until next time, we'll talk soon. Bye.